About 3 million years ago, our history began not far from these mountains in the Rift Valley, because there at that time the famous Lucy lived. She belonged to a group of primates that, for unknown reasons, had the privilege to develop into Homo sapiens. Probably because of climate change, which back then had not been our fault, and which led to longer periods of drought, these bipeds set off and gradually conquered the whole world. These primates have successfully asserted themselves against other species. One of the last was the Neanderthal, who was stronger than Homo sapiens, but not so clever. Perhaps that is why we are still so proud of the name sapiens today. In an area of the Middle East known to us from the Bible as paradise, Adam and Eve, after the story about the apple, received a recommendation from the Creator: multiply and subject the earth to yourselves. And they took this instruction all too literally. But the Lord was shocked subsequently by the devastating effects of his recommendation, and so he sent the flood. But that was no use either, for the descendants of Noah continued to cut down the forests and then burn the oil, which, as is well known, is the main cause of today's air pollution. Also here in Ethiopia, which because of Lucy is called the Cradle of Mankind, wood is used for cooking, especially to bake the local bread called injera. You need a lot of firewood. The housewives collect it in the surroundings of their villages, but since more and more people need ever more wood, the women have to search even further away from the village. For the landless, collecting wood is often the only source of income. They get the wood from the remaining forests, even if it is strictly forbidden. Only the trees surrounding the churches are spared because they are sacred. From this log, charcoal is also made, which will then be sold on every market. The Afar, the nomadic ethnic tribe that lives in the Dankali, have practically the exclusive rights for its collection, transport and sale on the markets, both as charcoal and wood. They are allowed because nobody really wants to go head to head with this warlike tribe. As the population increases, so does the number of animals. And for breeders, it is also an increase in prestige to own many animals. But ever more cattle have to share the Miega pastures today, which, like the forests, are decreasing from year to year. The goats especially tear out the grass together with the roots in the ground. This has devastating consequences and is the main reason for the increasing desertification, because the soil dries out faster. Also, thanks to their long necks, camels can feed on the acacia branches, and maybe the long thorns that protect the leaves make them somewhat spicy. The mass of hungry camels keep the growth of these trees to below 4 meters. In some regions, water scarcity is a serious problem. The baobab survives because it stores its considerable reserve of water in its enormous trunk and rarely develops leaves that could be used as animal feed. The various cactus species also protect themselves quite well with their needles and are able to tolerate periods of drought, a drought often caused by humans. In the east of the country, a lot of khat is cultivated, a drug that is then exported to Somalia. This shrub sucks a lot of groundwater from the ground, and the trees here need ever longer roots to get to the precious water. This means the dry soil is then more exposed to erosion by the wind, and in the summer monsoon, the rainwater washes down the fertile soil to the bare rock from the slopes. In order to save what can still be saved, The government has ordered these retaining walls to be built to stop erosion, but as you can see, without success. In some regions, the desert is advancing without the help of the man, who has caused this change by clearing the forests and destroying the vegetation with his herds of cattle. A renewed migration, as in the times of Lucy, cannot solve the problem, as is testified in the reception camps in Lampedusa. As long as the uncontrolled population growth is not identified as the main cause of the constant deterioration of the environment, these people continue heading towards disaster. But as long as the goats find enough cardboard boxes to eat, the situation is not yet completely hopeless. And when one of them starves to death, the vultures rejoice. Nature's rules of the game can be quite cruel, but so can those that humans deal upon themselves. In 1935, Ethiopia had 15 million inhabitants. Today it has almost 90 million. Despite civil wars, epidemics and famines, the one of 1984-85 alone has caused 1 million deaths. But today the world population increases by 1 million every 4.5 days. Both the priests of the Christian churches and the clerical leaders of the Muslims consider the condom as an invention of the devil, and still preach, multiply and subdue the earth. God will then take care of the feeding of the many children. According to this father of 9 children, he is not worried about that. Let's now visit the plateau of Ethiopia, the most fertile part of the country. Much of the agricultural produce comes from here: barley, wheat, millet and teff, which are used to make the typical Ethiopian bread injera, and is gluten-free. Agriculture here is still carried out using archaic methods, such as these wooden ploughs pulled by oxen, as they were used in Mesopotamia 4,000 years ago. The animals are also used for threshing, with the risk that sometimes some cow dung gets into the grain. The terrible famines of the last century were not caused by drought, but by social and political changes, which resulted in considerable mismanagement of resources. The last emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, was overthrown by a military junta that pursued Marxist-Leninist ideas, but had no idea how to manage an agricultural country like Ethiopia. What work motivation can one expect from a farmer who has been informed that he no longer owns his land or animals and is now only a state employee? But with a guaranteed starvation wage, certain ideologies have claimed millions of victims before being written off as useless. Today, the farmers are again the owners of their fields and beneficiaries of the fruits of their labour, with which they can feed their families. And if there is some of the harvest left over, they can sell it on the markets, even if their average income is then only $1 a day, and therefore statistically remains below the poverty line. In spite of all of this, they have never lost their dignity in their way of life. Today, all agriculturally usable soils are cultivated. Farmland is not increasing alongside the population, and many sons of large families have to move to the cities to look for work, as was necessary in our country at the beginning of industrialization. But the problem is there is hardly any industry in Ethiopia that could give these landless people work. There are many local craft businesses, but there are not enough to employ all of them. In any case, the construction industry is not booming as a result of the baby boom. Building houses is not a worthwhile investment. Houses are built with logs, possibly clay or stones. Because the money for corrugated iron is often lacking, roofs are often made with straw. The nomads are content with these improvised accommodations, which are then covered with mats of braided palm leaves. Only in the larger settlements, real houses with windows and doors are built, in which the merchants can have their shops and boutiques, and where the latest fashions of the Chinese textile industry are offered. Most of the junk here comes from the Middle Kingdom, and only at weekly markets in the villages, products of local agriculture are offered, such as chickpeas, lentils, corn, barley and teff, and of course, mountains of peppers. When you see this rich offering, you wouldn't think that just a generation ago people died of hunger here. As there is no running water in most houses, people fetch it from the well or from the nearest creek, where they also wash their clothes. It goes without saying that the water quality does not meet our Western hygiene standards. In addition to a portion of detergent, it can also show traces of donkey and goat urine. And because of the coli bacteria, only half of the children reach adulthood, many dying of intestinal infections from the contaminated drinking water. Ethiopia is one of the poorest countries in the world, and therefore a popular playground for international aid organisations. And there is a lot to do. So as not to get their feet wet, Helvet has had a suspension bridge built here. But because animals don't like to pass over it, people walk their cattle through the water, like they used to do before. Ethiopians are accustomed to long-distance walking, and only at most using donkeys or dromedaries to transport goods. But nowadays this does not seem acceptable, and some nations have offered cooperation in their development aid programs in Africa. The Chinese in particular are very committed to modernizing the Ethiopian road network, still often from the Italian colonial period. For economic reasons, they have their fingers in pies everywhere in Africa. They are, of course, creating temporary jobs, because in addition to the heavy construction machinery used by the Chinese, much is still done by the simplest methods, as was done in China not so long ago. The successful emancipation of women in Ethiopia can also be observed on these construction sites. They are not even denied physically strenuous work, even if they are paid less than their male colleagues. They enthusiastically seize the opportunity to be allowed to lend a hand to the development of their country. However, I doubt if they will ever drive in their own cars on the roads that they have paved. This 4-lane highway, which the Chinese built from Mekelle to the Dankali deserts, is of little use to the local population, as only a few goat herders live here. They do this rather with the intention of getting the mining rights for the salt and other minerals of this area, in order to transport them quickly to the harbour of Djibouti. Today, the new roads have already considerably shortened the travel time by car or public bus between cities, provided there are no breakdowns on the way. But, as already mentioned, the majority of the population are still on foot. For them, the roads have changed practically nothing, other than they now have to inhale exhaust fumes and run the risk of landing under a truck. Ethiopian fauna has also had to adapt to the new environmental situation. Instead of struggling to find food in the rest of the jungle, the monkeys are now begging the bus passengers along the roads, with the risk of losing their lives because of a banana. But for these monkeys, it's the only way to make ends meet. In Africa, there are many regions that can only permanently make ends meet by food donations from humanitarian organizations, temporary disasters notwithstanding. Famine becomes the rule, but this aid does not solve the problem in the long term. It only exacerbates it. Family planning might be a way out, but nobody wants to hear about it here. People here are incredibly imaginative at inventing professions as a source of income. This man, with his umbrella as a collecting box, collects money for a church renovation, but has no success with this pastor, who comes from another parish. This man prepares a local speciality from ketchup for the travellers. He has set up his field kitchen near the new Chinese bridge over the Nile, because everyone stops here to admire this architectural wonder. The food here would actually have been free, but donations are of course welcome, and those who have shown themselves to be generous also get water to clean themselves. Others do business with these stools. Sewn in goat skins, they give the interior a rustic touch. Thanks to Chinese know-how, almost the entire population wears these plastic sandals made in Ethiopia. Instead of distributing fish symbolically, the development workers taught the people here how to fish. The green ones are the most popular. Another example of development age is the domestic production of sanitary towels. These are ecologically more wearable because they don't end up in the garbage after use as with us, but are washable and can therefore be used for years. Because their use in Ethiopia is virtually unknown, there is still a lot of work to be done to supply a market of 18 million women of childbearing age. The initiative came from Mariam Saber, who previously immigrated to the USA, but recently returned to her hometown of Mekele to contribute to the development of her country, and in particular to improve the situation of the women here.
They are from Ethiopia. I see that the woman from Tigray.
To attach it to the underwear. So it will last 3 to 4 hours, depends on the flow. So if a girl has her period, she has this, no problem. At any time, it's washable. So once it's washed, with the clothes liner, you can dry it, completely dry. And then after that, after their period is done, they use it like this, and they keep it in their pocket all the time.
Okay.
To make it easier to obtain mining rights or favourable trade agreements, the Chinese are very generous to local politicians, which has led to considerable prosperity for some rulers, naturally in the name of solidarity between the two nations, and of course in the name of progress. With the new roads, Ethiopia is now trying to catch up with the economic upswing and finally leave behind its archaic ways of life, which for thousands of years have only progressed at a donkey's or camel's pace. They have always taken care of the transport of goods here, but today they cannot survive against the competition of lorries in the long run. These may pollute the environment, but are faster and have a much larger loading capacity. With the caravans, however, a world that managed without oil but set limits to economic growth is disappearing. The question remains whether this development will make the people here happier. But as long as the uncontrolled population growth deprives this country of its vital resources, the forecasts for the future seem rather bleak. The attempt to replace the use of firewood for cooking with electrical energy produced by these wind turbines probably only works in rural areas with a lot of wind, but not in a megacity like Addis Ababa, which is still growing all of the time. But in the end, the people here have to decide whether they should take certain recommendations of the Old Testament really so literally.